that come up. Now, for those of you who didn't get it, there is a handout that I gave. And although there was a slight misstatement, I do tons of programs on any number of issues: boundaries, hazing, harassment, bullies, handbooks, employee handbooks, everything else. But this is the first time I'm presenting on the legal and risk management of taking in international students. As a law firm, where our experiences are helping people to draft their enrollment agreements, the day-to-day risk management issues that come up when you have a student from an international area coming into your school and encountering issues, helping schools to be approved as the StISS or CVEP school to be able to take in those students. So there are many areas, but I've actually never presented it, so you're my test case here. So what I did is put my thinking cap on to say all of you, and we've got various things. People who have been doing this for years, people who are thinking about it, people who are in their first year. So on page 2, you'll see what are the overall risks. Now, you have risks running a school. They're inherent whether your student is American or your student is international. But there are some things, as was pointed out this morning, is you want to put the umbrella on and say, what's special about the international student population that I have to think about? So you want to look at things like selections and applications for families and students, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But you're going to have maybe different questions that you're asking to be able to garner, is that a good match for your school? Are you a good match for them? One overriding principle I would say to you, don't promise what you can't deliver. Now, that should be the case in any, but especially when you have this international complexion to it and the distance issues, you want to make sure that what you're saying or what your agent is saying that is going to be your school environment is actually what you are. It's not a wish list. We're going to talk about criminal background checks. When you're doing host families, our recommendation is you do a criminal background check on the host family, the partner, and any adult member of that community. That's our recommendation for every residential school. When you have dorm parents, we want you to do your employee, their partner or spouse, and any adult member. So it's really just applying it over to say you're doing that in that area as well. Reference checks. Many of your communities, the people who will serve as host families are well known to you. But you want to make sure that if someone's not so well known, that you have a good pulse on what this family is really all about. Because again, the in loco parentis, acting from a legal perspective as the parent would, will be applying, and you want to make sure you do that. Home inspections. Are you actually going to go out and look at the house? That is a recommended. You don't want to take their word for it. You've got all different kind of homes. And I think a home inspection like seeing the child on Skype is going to tell you a lot. Orientation of the students and families. Suzanne told you this morning, extremely critical, and it is not a workshop. It is the ongoing relationship from beginning to end and everything that comes up in the middle with heightened scrutiny. Like when you have a child in crisis who may have gone through some kind of a bullying event or something, what we always say, you want to have heightened scrutiny and supervision over this child to make sure that you have the pulse that they're really doing okay. Your international student is a little bit like that. It's not a crisis. It's a wonderful addition, but there's too many unknowns for them and also for your community. So you really want to make sure that the advisor isn't just being the regular advisor, but understanding this added component of that. Academic information from the student home countries, I think we saw some of that. Is it accurate? Can you trust what your agent is giving you? How do you verify that? When you get stung, you don't want to get stung too many times before you say, you know what, this is not a reliable source for this information. Placement of the students, we've learned, very critical to make the match, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Monitoring reports. Do you require what is it that you send home to the family, the international family, that lets them know how things are going? This is their precious child, no matter what country they're from. And I actually pulled, before I came here, StISS does this Student and Exchange General Summary Quarterly Review, and I pulled the one from April 1st, 2001. And when you were talking about where are the students coming from, by and large, you have a big line graph for China. Absolutely overwhelming number. But I thought you'd be interested in the top 10. China first, South Korea second. Anybody guess on India? Oh, I said India. India's third. Anybody want to guess fourth?
Brazil.
Vietnam.
Okay, they're all in the mix. Saudi Arabia. Yeah, Saudi Arabia, Canada, Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam, Mexico, and Brazil is 10th. But that's an interesting dynamic. And so if you want to get this, I just got it offline, and there's some wonderful information about, you can get a list of what are all the StISS approved schools in New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, every state there is. And so that I thought you might be interested in knowing. So monitoring the host family and how the child is doing from the advisor, from the family, and sending that information home. Emergency contact information and protocols critical. You know, we just heard the example of the child who's in the hospital. Do you have your proper consent form so that you can go to have the medical attention? That wasn't quite medical attention. It was, who was the child released to? Does that child understand that if something happens that they need to communicate back to the school so that you can make the connection there? You don't want teenagers making those kinds of decisions. Overall consent forms. You want to look at all of your forms and say, is there anything additional that I need to add to this? Because most of what you have already is going to work. You're going to have the medical consent form. You're going to have the travel. Can they get in a car? Can they drive? What are those issues? Handbooks. I'm a strong believer in a very well-worded student and family handbook that goes home to the family that people sign for. I also think you should have a host family handbook. And what I did was, or a homestay guide, I went online to say, because we're developing, new products all the time, and I said, well, what's a really good one for anyone who doesn't have one? And I happened to find this one. It's Prairie Spirit School Division. So I skimmed around. This is fabulous. It is a homestay guide that says, here's your basic rules and expectations. Our family's going to provide a safe and friendly environment. But it talks about everything from what is the student's role in the family, the obligation of the family to tell you about family changes, what's the code of conduct, what about curfews, can there be sleepovers, how about spending money, what about alcohol, personal spending, clothing, and it's not that long, but it really covers a lot. So out of all the things I skimmed, so it was called Prairie Spirit School Division International Education Program, and it just was really capsulized, a very good guide that would be again, a handbook is something, even whether it's your student, your employee, or this host stay guide, it is not something you say, here it is. You have to train it, teach it, live it, pull it out. This is your guide. You're constantly going back through the orientations. You're going to want to have it and say, now as you know, like a question that a parent has. When I, as a lawyer, get a call and I get a question, I always say, okay, we're dealing with alcohol, substance abuse by a child. What does your handbook say? Let's pull it out. Take a look, even if you've dealt with that 20 times over. You want to take a look. And so if a family says, I had this issue about curfew, well, let's see what it says in here. And every year you're going to put little stickers on it, because as you get more experience or your program grows, you're going to go, you know what, that didn't quite do it. Let's modify it for next year. But always use this so that they come to rely on it to help you, because you can't be in every home at every minute. So this is going to be a helpful tool for you. Liability insurance, when you're engaging in this kind of a program, as with anything, you just want to have the conversation with your liability carrier. By the way, we're adding this. Are there any additional riders or kinds of coverages that we need to get? Health insurance and medical management. I guess I throw this out for someone who has the program. Is there a certain kind of medical insurance you require the international student to have? What is it called?
I don't know the company, but it is.
It's like an international.
Yeah,
okay, and that's what I understood it to be. But you want to take a look at that. And again, if there are certain things where you say, I'm going to require this kind of insurance. I also say in your enrollment agreement, which you're going to talk about a bit, you want to have in there something that says medical costs. In the event that the school is required, and I do this in all enrollment agreements, not just international, but I looked at a lot of those too. I was surprised at how skimpy some of them are. The enrollment agreement, but I think there should be a provision that if the school is forced to expend any funds for the medical treatment of the student, that the parent agrees to reimburse the school for that fund. I put that in for every student, but I think especially in the international student world you want to do that. Confidentiality and communications. I'm going to talk about it here because I have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. There's actually a lot of legal issues. One thing I want to say to you is don't be overwhelmed. Anytime a lawyer comes in and talks in the room, it's like, uh-oh. I was once told, Linda, seeing you was like having a root canal. I'm like, I'm much nicer than that. But usually you're dealing with me on issues that, you wish you didn't have. But in any event, so on this issue of communications and confidentiality, I have always worried that there is open communication between the school and the agents, absent an authorization to do that. So I would commend you, because there is a recognized, in some cases, in some states, it has been recognized that students have a privacy interest in their student records. Okay? You know that need to know circle from medical. That's been hammered home to us, okay? But just in general, student records. So I'm kind of like, I like to be on the head of the curve. Don't wait till it happens to you and figure out you should have had an authorization. It's an easy thing. When you're engaged in that relationship, you have the family sign something that says, this will acknowledge that the school has the right to be able to communicate with the agent on any matters concerning the well-being, concerning my child. Why? Because a lot of those agency relationships continue through the child being with your school. So they want to know, is the child flunking out? Is the child doing well? And I do not, from a legal perspective, feel comfortable with you having that communication absent that consent. You also stick it in the handbook. And in your handbook, you say, international student section. One of the pieces you're going to add is to say this will also confirm that the school has the right to be able to communicate with any agent, consultant, etc., hired by the family as to the students, how, anything regarding the student, unless the parent specifically revokes that, because they may end that relationship and then you don't. But again, I see it happening all the time in my practice, and I'm always like, so just word of caution there. Immunizations, there is the issue that you're going to want to request the medical records and immunization records. One thing that occurred to me as I was sitting here that I don't know, for instance, in New Hampshire you have the annual immunization reporting that you have to do. I don't know if there's a similar thing in other states. Like, how does that mesh with the immunization records that you get? Clearly you want to get them in English so you can know what they say, but I don't know the answer to that, but that's an issue that we're going to want to figure out as we move along. Copies of visa, passports, and photos. You know how kids are. Are they going to have it or are they going to lose it? Where does it go? And my understanding is that most schools will safeguard that for the student in their office in a locked area so that they have it and also have a copy of it, so that you've got double checks and balances there. Orientation of students, I can't say enough that it's an ongoing process. Enrollment agreement, we'll talk about in a minute. Acting in local parentis, yes, you have in local parentis responsibilities about these children who have been entrusted to you. And local parentis, as you may know, under the law means acting in the stead of the parent as the parent would have for that child. And so you do adopt that. You accept these students. You own them in local parentis, just as you do all your students. That's no different. Whether you're a day school or a residential school, you have those in local parentis. StISS regulations are the regulations so that if a school wants to do more than just a 2-week exchange program where somebody's here on a more short-term, maybe visitor visa, you want to accept these students for a long-term, something that may lead to a degree, you need to become an approved school for that. And I actually got a crash course from Tom Hildreth from my office who does this with the schools, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Understanding cultural differences. One thing I haven't heard yet, but I think this is a two-way street. If you're going to be accepting in students from a certain country and have, say, a lot of students from Korea, as we heard, that had certain characteristics, you may want to try to know, maybe from the agents or on your own research, what are some things about their culture that may not fit here. And I, as a lawyer, have been called in specifically about this Korean issue. The older boys, how they treated the younger boys, and that behavior violated the bullying and hazing policies of the school. And did the school have the right to enforce their policies? What is the answer?
They do.
Yes. Absolutely. But you want to do it with cultural sensitivity. Okay, if that's how it is when the child goes back home and they're going to slide right back into those behaviors and have it culturally accepted and maybe even promoted, you want to have cultural sensitivity to it, not just say as a person you can't act this way. What they have to understand is we have laws in that regulate our school. We've adopted policies to help you understand those, and this is how you have to act when you're here. And you may also want to have an explanation to the family about that. But there's all different kinds of cultural things that come up. But I think it would behoove you in the learning process to try to learn some of those things about the populations that are coming to you. Religious, again, we heard about that especially for the parochial schools. I sit on the board at Riviera College, although I'm not a Catholic, I'm Greek Orthodox. You don't necessarily, what you want to do is to say, my children went to Bishop Gert. What you want to say is, there is a religious component. Yes, you do have to go to chapel. Yes, you do have to go to Mass. Yes, you do have to take these religion courses. That is part of our school culture, and that's not going to be waived. You have the right as a religious school to be able to do that. Dietary restrictions, obviously you want to find that out on the application. You don't want to run into issues. You also want to help your students understand U.S. laws and customs. You know, we're here, Susan said a lot of that acclimation that they have. What side of the street do they walk on? What side of the street do they ride their bike on? You know, what does that mean when they see something that has a hand signal? You know, all those things you can't take for granted. You really have to have that kind of cultural assimilation, and which helps you to avoid problems and legal issues. Medication management, I throw it in there because it is a big issue even with any school population, but especially with the international, you want to let them know what they're doing.
Linda, your bullet.
I thought we were going to 12:30. Okay, so for the enrollment contracts, the unconditional obligations pay, but there are some things that you're going to need to add in because, so you're going to entitle it different. This is my international student. How is it different? It's typically going to cover those additional fees that may apply to the international student, such as the ESL, perhaps an extra fee, such as the trips, you know, to Disneyland or other things that you may not be providing. What are the costs of that? Making sure that they're in there. And then there's going to be a statement for those of you that are the CVIP approved that talks about, okay, now that you get this, here's what you need to do under the I-20. Here's the process that you need to take. And that's going to be right in your enrollment agreement. So that's sort of my J, consent forms. I just said example, medical treatment, travel. But again, that's really something for your entire student population. You know, this, can they go away for the weekend? Can they get in a car? What rights do they have? You know, seniors have these rights, you know, third formers have these rights, whatever it is. You want to have that, but you want to help the international student to understand what that means and the family to understand. But there's all kinds of permissions. Can they use the climbing wall? Can they, you know, what's the athletic permission? There's different schools have all different ones, but you're right, permission slips. Yeah. I think when you have your enrollment agreement, whatever payment schedules you require, they're hard and fast payment schedules. And if it says that in failure to get payment by X date will mean that your child is going to be let go, you know, again, enrollments agreements is probably a topic you want to take because there's a lot of pieces that apply here. I touched it ever so briefly. If we can move to that on page 4, the enrollment contract is really much the same for the international student as it should be. So whether it's the international student not paying because they're waiting for currency or some family not paying for whatever reason they have, what you want to have in there is, hopefully, I believe you should have the unconditional obligation to pay, which the courts will enforce. That says, you know, unconditional obligation to pay if you withdraw for any reason, whether voluntary or involuntary, medical, disciplinary, you name it, you know, whatever. You owe us this tuition. You have things like that. But you also, here's the payment plan. You have to comply with that payment plan.
Place.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of contractual provisions. For instance, you know, do you want to know what they have for liability insurance? But, yeah, you want to try to keep your form here in all your contract disputes because by, you know, again, advertising in other countries, you don't want to have to go to China to defend a case. You want to be able to keep it here. So there's a lot of provisions like that that a lawyer would help you to do. And so your enrollment agreement covers some of that to say what your rights are, but you're talking about the processes that actually happen, such as you need to, we're going to send your child home, we're going to put them on a plane, you agree to that. So again, no matter how much careful planning you do, understand that in this world of so many elements of this kind of a relationship, as it is with your child, there's no way you will plan for everything. And that's why you want to have a good team, a good experience, try to learn as much as you can, go to programs like this, constantly be improving your knowledge as you move along, learning from it, debriefing after an incident occurs so that your response team learns from that. I don't think it's a hard and fast rule, but I'll tell you some different examples. I think that you need to deal in that situation cooperatively with the parent to reach an agreement about how that's going to be handled. So typically it would be not when they leave your gate. It's if you're driving to the airport, you ensure that they're on the plane. It's not drop off at the airport, that's it. Because it's only sort of like once they get in the air that you can say, at that point I had no control. But if that child goes to the airport and never gets on the plane, I think as a school you're going to own that. Likewise, coming in, if the issue is they land in Boston or whatever town that Hartford, and you're going to pick them up at 10, then that you own them from that point forward. And you can try to say contractually, well, it's only once they get here, and you have to provide the transportation between the airport and here. Well, if you did that, and the parent had to provide that transportation until they got to your school, then you wouldn't have it until they got to the school. But are you really going to do that to them? Probably not. You're going to provide that transportation. So there are these switches, and very often in a dismissal, it is unplanned and it is tough. You're expelling them. The parents are saying, no, you can't. This is you. And you have to say no. So these are areas where increasingly we might add something to the handbook. And I like that, and I've added it to my list of things to say what actually happens when they have to depart. So you can say, here, you agreed to this. Again, in an independent school, I know some of you are town academies and some of you are public schools, but in an independent school, your relationship with your student and families is largely contractual. And if they sign that handbook that says, after they get dropped off at the airport, they are no longer our responsibility, then a court would likely enforce that.
Okay, thank you very much.